My brothers and sisters, may the Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. After the crowd had eaten their fill, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and proceed him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After doing so, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. At once Jesus spoke to them. "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" After they got into the boat, the wind died down, and those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord. We celebrate today the dedication of the basilicas of St. Peter's and St. Paul's in Rome. By the 12th century, this was a feast of commemorating the building of these two edifices over where tradition had it. The remains of Peter and Paul were found. And in this present century, there's been a number of very serious excavations and archaeological digs to try to verify that fact. And it seems pretty clear in both instances that these are in fact the places and the remains of Peter and Paul. The basilicas themselves were built initially back in the 4th century, the original ones. And it was probably just in this last century or so that the church moved these celebrations, which had been going on since the 12th century, for the entire church calendar, which is why we also celebrate it. And it isn't so much a celebration specifically of a building as much as it is a reminder to us of the foundation stones, if you will, that Peter and Paul themselves were for the early church. It's interesting when you look at the personalities of both as they show themselves in the scriptures. They surely are at opposite ends of things. There's Peter, who is very quick and rather uneducated and makes a lot of foibles and mistakes, and yet always is zealously in turn in response to Jesus. At the same time, there's Paul, who was educated and for a long period of time persecuted the Christians out of a conviction that they were heretics. And yet both of them ultimately became the great preachers, if you will, for the faith. In the case of Peter, for the foundation of the early church, as Jesus gave him the command to be the shepherd, the leader of the community. And for Paul, bringing that same message to the greater world, to the world around us in the Gentile community. The readings today focus on each of them from a different perspective. The first reading from the Acts of the Apostles that you heard is telling us about Paul's movement into the city of Rome. And again, it gets sort of interesting how God works through strange situations to bring about his own will and way. If you recall, Peter ultimately began having real issues once he started having real issues with the Jewish community because of his preaching and proclaiming Jesus. And so they wanted to take him off to prison. And ultimately, Paul used the excuse that, well, he's a Roman citizen, he should be tried in Rome. And so he makes his way to Rome and spends the next 2-3 years there under guard duty, but nevertheless still relatively free to act in the midst of the community, and becomes the great teacher and preacher of Jesus there in the city of Rome. And Peter himself, at one point totally away from the city, eventually comes back as well. Both of them lose their lives for the sake of the gospel there. And as the inscriptions in many places in the city of Rome suggest, it is the glorious blood of these two martyrs that gave birth and life to the church. And so as we remember Peter and Paul, and we will realize how God works sometimes in strange ways, we're also reminded how he works through each of us. Sometimes events happen in our lives when we look back in hindsight, kind of boggle the mind that they took place, and yet they become the facilitators of something good in our life or some change in our life. Sometimes it's things that are difficult in our lives that become precisely the jumping off point for a strengthening of faith. And just as Peter and Paul had their own foibles and their own weaknesses and insufficiencies, so each of us, with all of our foibles and insufficiencies, still can be used by the Lord as a means of grace and means of witness to the gospel. Let Peter and Paul then continue to safeguard the church by their intercession. And may we in turn, in our roles as Christians of this day and age, be preachers of the word.